and then I will come back 3 days later. All right? And that was I don't know how you could get any more plain than that, right? It's different, it's different than saying, someday something bad might happen, and saying, I'm going to die a week from now on Friday at 4 p.m., right? I mean, that's a very certain, clear way of saying this is going to happen, and yet the disciples still don't seem to get it, right? Peter stands up and starts telling Jesus, you're wrong. I mean, that takes some gall right there. After all he's seen Jesus do, to stand up and say, no, Jesus, you're wrong. You're not going to die. And so, it's just that's part of it. Jesus was trying to prepare him because he knew something was coming along that was going to rock their worlds, and he did not want them to walk into it blindly. So he was trying to disabuse them of the delusion that following him was going to be all blessing and no burden, that there was not going to be any pain, any suffering. That's what drives me nuts about these prosperity preachers. And they get up and they say, Jesus wills that everything, that's not the way the Bible works, right? I mean, you look at in Scripture, and it's like every person that committed themselves to serving God and doing what God required of them, they faced opposition. They faced struggle. They faced fear and pain and all these sorts of things. And that's just part of it, right? I mean, we're going to face that stuff anyway, whether we're a Christian or not. But as soon as you decide that you're going to start following God, it's like the opposition increases, right? But why is that? Well, it's because you're finally doing what God has asked you to do, and so now the enemy is going to start throwing extra stuff at you. And just like with Jesus, Satan tried to attack Jesus. He tempted him in the desert, and Jesus was able to fend off all of that temptation, and he saw demon after demon was cast out. Nothing that Satan had in his arsenal could touch Jesus, right? And so how did he start trying to come after Jesus then? Well, he started coming after through the disciples, through the people he cared about, right? His own brothers and sisters were not believing that he was the Messiah, even though his mother had received a visitation from the angel. You had the disciples turning against each other. You had James and John saying, hey, Jesus, when you get in your kingdom, we want to be on the right and left. And it caused a whole big hubbub between all the disciples. They were being attacked. And Jesus even says, listen, when I'm struck down, you're going to be scattered. Once the shepherd's gone, you're going to be scattered. But remember, I'm coming back. So he's trying to walk them through this and help them prepare for the fact that this isn't all going to be, parades and banquets and feasts and fun stuff. That's just not the way it works. So he made it very, very clear, and he said, one of the things that we notice when we look at this is that he said it was necessary for the Son of Man to suffer. So this isn't an optional thing. It's not like, well, there were 3 plans, and this was the one we decided on. No, it's necessary, right? It's necessary that this would happen. And so if you think about the implications of that, if that becomes necessary, then that means that the plan that God created was a plan that involved suffering. It involved pain. It involved humiliation. It involved death, right? All really terrible things, and he planned that for his son, who he loved, all right? And so that's kind of mind-boggling because we think, well, God, he's my father. He loves me. He's my good, good father. It's who he is. It's who he is, and I'm loved by him. And we like to think about those things, and those things are true, but that doesn't mean that there isn't some suffering and some pain and some humiliation and some loss that you will face in the course of your walk with Christ. And so, yes, all of those things, those were part of God's plan, but God had a plan to take those negative things that you're going to experience anyway, whether you're a follower of Christ or not, and then redeem them, right? To bring something beautiful out of something painful and hurtful. And there's a lot of times we face stuff in life and we're like, I don't know why I had to go through that. I don't know why this happened. And some stuff is just misfortune, right? Like there are some things that have happened to me, some penalties of sin that I have paid in my life, and I can point back to something and I can say, I know why I suffered that consequence, because I stepped out of line in this case. I did something I wasn't supposed to do, and because I stepped out of line, I paid the penalty for that. But there's other times stuff hits you and it's like, this isn't fair. I didn't earn this. I didn't do anything to deserve this. Or you're suffering the penalty that maybe someone else earned, right? I mean, especially when it comes to like your family. I think about, families that come from broken homes, right? The kids didn't do anything to contribute to that, but how many times do families that come from children that come from divorced families, they beat themselves up and they feel like it's my fault. I did this. And they're paying the penalty because two adults can't work something out, right? And not to place judgment there, but it's just, sometimes things hit us and they're just not fair. There's no reason for it. It's just part of life, Some people are born into terrible situations. Some people are born with medical conditions, and they have to deal with that their entire life. And you're like, God, what did I do to deserve that? It's not like the type of diabetes that you get from eating 47 Twinkies a day, right? Some of us just have it because it's part of our genetics. And it's like, we didn't do anything to deserve that. We didn't choose that, right? But we deal with it. And so everything, though, that comes our way, if we are believers, if we've committed our whole lives to Christ, then God's going to take that was negative and he's going to redeem it and bring something out of it. I don't know what he's going to bring out of it, and sometimes it'll lead to death, right? I mean, that's just part of it. We think, well, we have our loved ones and God wouldn't take my loved ones from me. Yes, he will, because we're all going to die someday, It's going to happen. Whether it's tomorrow or next decade or next century. I don't know when it's going to happen for you, but it's going to happen. And that's something that we have to deal with. And just because we deal with the loss doesn't mean that God doesn't love us. Doesn't mean that he doesn't have a plan for us. I can't tell you how many people I've seen that get saved at a funeral. Why? Because that funeral reminds them that, hey, we're all going to die. And I'm going to die too someday, And so even that, a loss, which is sad and it hurts, and we think, man, I miss my loved one. I just want grandma back, But then if God can take that and bring another soul to salvation through that you see him redeeming something that's painful and hurtful and making something beautiful out of that. So Jesus is teaching us, that sometimes God's plan involves some things that we'd rather not have. I'd rather not have pain. I'd rather not have suffering. I'd rather not have humiliation. But if I've committed myself fully to God, then that's what's going to happen. I was reading an article today, and I haven't finished it yet, but man, just the part I read was rocking my world. It was talking about an early Church of God pastor. His name was J.H. Ingram, and when he first became saved, he got saved, and he was in a revival, and he saw people speaking in tongues and operating under the baptism of the Holy Spirit, and he wanted it so bad. He wanted it so bad, and he sought God, and he said, look, if you will just give me this baptism of the Holy Spirit, I'll go wherever you want me to go. I'll say whatever you want me to say. I'll do whatever you want me to do. And he would say later on, he's like, if I knew what all that was going to mean, maybe I wouldn't have made that deal with God. But God came through on his end, and so now I'm going to stay, faithful on my end. And sometimes if we think about that, and we think about the things that come in our life that we would really not rather deal with, if we have committed our lives to God, God will take that, he will use it, and we will accomplish so much more than we would if we were just chasing worldly things, earthly things that pass away, that you can't take with you. So Jesus was trying to be very, very blunt with the disciples at this point. It's interesting. You see that Jesus kind of understood that there comes a turning point, right? He starts off using parables, and he's very confusing, and people are like, well, who is this guy? I don't know who he is. And over time, he reveals more and more, and then you see that he'll teach with these parables where he's teaching a truth through a story or something like that, and then he'll pull the disciples aside and say, here, let me give you the skinny behind this. Let me tell you what this all means, right? Let me tell you the hidden message that's in this story that I'm trying to get across to you. But then he eventually moves beyond that to this point where he's just saying, listen, guys, I'm going to be straight with you. I'm about to die. They're going to drag me off. They're going to beat me up. They're going to kill me. It's not going to be fun, right? But remember, I'm coming back in 3 days. He's telling you, you're going to go through a tunnel. You're going to go through a dark place, but there's a light at the end of the tunnel. And just like the resurrection was the light at the end of the tunnel for his crucifixion, we also, as believers, have a light at the end of the tunnel, right? We have our own resurrection. We have his glorious return to look forward to. So even though we're going to face some things in our life that we don't want to, and there are some days where we're like, God, take it from me. I don't want to deal with this anymore. I don't think I can handle another day of this. I've said that in my prayer closet. I can't tell you how many times I've said, God, I can't take another day of this, right? But there's a light at the end of the tunnel. There's always hope to hold on to. So, the interesting thing is that Jesus could have just let them all figure it out, right? He could have not warned them, but he could have waited, and then 3 days later he could have popped out and been like, surprise, right? But he didn't do that. He told them, he said, be watching for me. Wait for me. Go tell my disciples to go ahead of me into Galilee, and I'll meet them there, right? He wasn't trying to pull one over on them. He was trying to walk them through it because he knew it was going to be one of the darkest times of their life, right? Because they're all sitting there wondering, well, they just killed Jesus. Am I next? Right? Because they know I've been following him. They know that for the last 3 years I've been part of his posse. And when he goes down, am I going down too? What's this going to mean? Right? And he knew that they were going to go through something really terrible, but he didn't want them to just stumble blindly through it. He wanted to take their hand and walk them through and tell them it's going to be okay. And, you know, it's funny, when you're in the middle of something, it's hard to get that it's going to be okay into your head and actually believe it, right? That's one thing. I was talking with somebody earlier this week, and they were stressing out about a situation that was going on, and I said, don't worry about it. I said, just don't worry about it. And she said, well, how can you say that? And I said, because I've been through so much, and everything I've gone through, God's brought me through. Everything I've needed, he's provided, you know? Do I drive around in a Cadillac Escalade with gold rims and wear Armani suits everywhere I go? No, I do not. But I've never not had what I needed. God's taken care of me. Even when I didn't know where it was coming from, God's taken care of me. And it's the same way. You know, I've been through too much. I've seen too much. I've seen God move on behalf of his people too much to waste my time worrying. So when Jesus was trying to guide them through this process, it shows us that God, even though we're going to face things in our lives that we're not necessarily fans of and we don't want to deal with, he doesn't want us to do so blindly and stumbling around and not knowing what's coming next. So, back to a point that I've already made a couple times before, is that in this human life, pain and suffering is going to come our way. It just is. It's the nature of it. You know, I've been reading all these news stories, and they talk about, you know, the problems of bullying in our schools and how terrible it is. And I think, you know, hasn't everybody been bullied, right? We've all been bullied at some point. Maybe we've been picked on. Maybe we weren't really bullied at school. Maybe we were bullied at home through a sibling or a verbally abusive parent or grandparent. Or maybe we made it all the way through our childhood and we got into adulthood and we got into a job where we were bullied by a coworker who would start rumors about us and try to turn people against us. Or maybe it was a boss that just didn't like you. You know, one time I had a boss that he wrote up a bunch of disciplinary warnings and put them in my file, and they were just completely made up things that he put in my file so that he could try and fire me. And I was able to go back and prove that I didn't do all those things that he wrote in there. And so, you know, God protected me in that situation. But, I mean, that was bullying. I was a grown man at that point with a wife and a child at home, and I was being bullied by someone at work. And so, you know, that pain and suffering, it's going to happen. It will happen. But since we know that's going to happen anyway, we shouldn't be scared of it, right? Because the whole point is, whenever you do something, you have to weigh the risk and the reward, right? So if I want to go invest in this thing, there's a risk to it. I might lose my money, but I could potentially gain this return. Is the promise of that return, is that high enough that I'm willing to risk putting this into it? You know, going bungee jumping. I've always said I would rather jump out of an airplane than go bungee jumping, because I just think big guys and rubber bands don't go together, you know. And I figure if I jump out of a plane and the parachute doesn't open, well, I'll only be upset for a couple seconds, and then it's all over, right? You know, and so, you know, but the risk versus the reward, you know, I don't see it when it comes to bungee jumping. It just seems to me like that's more likely to go wrong. And maybe I'm wrong on that. I haven't studied that. I'm not an insurance actuarial guy, you know. But anyway, you weigh the risk, you weigh the reward. Well, here's the thing. It's not really a risk to risk pain and suffering in this life. So when you stand up for Christ, when you stand up and you do the right thing, it's not really much of a risk, because you know pain and suffering is coming your way anyway, right? But here's the thing. When you're risking it for God, the reward that you can get is so much better, right? You could risk taking money from your workplace, right? And that's one thing I've never understood, people who will steal little things from their job. And I'm like, why would you do that? Is it really worth losing your job and potentially going to jail over, you know, $100 out of the cash register? Is it really worth that? Right? But when you do the right thing, when you follow through and when you risk things for God, when you stand up for what you believe, then God will see that and he will reward it, and it's so much better. How many of you guys, did anybody see the movie came out about 10 years ago called End of the Spear? Talking about missionaries. The guy down in Ecuador, his name was Jim Elliot. And he was kind of paraphrasing this passage of the Bible when he was talking about why he was willing to go and risk his life to try and share the gospel with these native tribes. And he said, he is no fool who gives what he cannot keep to gain what he cannot lose. Right? So he's saying it's not foolish to risk what you cannot keep. I can't keep my life. I can't keep my safety. I can't keep my family's happiness. You know, honestly, all of that, as much as we try to put systems in place to protect ourselves, we can't completely protect our family, right? We can have all the insurance policies in the world. We can have a huge nest egg saved up for retirement, but we can't help if some driver runs a red light and hits our car, you know? We can't control that. And so, you know, it's not foolish to make some risks to gain something that you cannot lose. We'll risk a ton to gain earthly things, but when we risk for God, the reward that we get is laid up where? Where the thief cannot steal, where the moth cannot eat it. It can't be taken from us. And so that's why it's not foolish at all to stand up and say, I'm a believer. I believe in God. I believe that this is the way things should be. You know, we live in a world that rejects us. I mean, that they consider us foolish anyway. You know, I was listening to an interview not too long ago where a lady was defending abortion, and she said, you know, for all these Christians that talk about they're pro-life, she said, I want to know how many kids have they adopted, how many foster children live in their homes, and I'm thinking, you know, she'll say and do anything, because when you look at the statistics, the vast majority of children that are adopted or fostered are done so by Christian organizations or Christian families. You know, we're walking our walk. The thing is it's, you know, costs upwards of $40,000 to adopt a child. You know, whereas you can abort one for under $500. It's crazy. It's crazy. We live in a world that they don't even use logic, and then they try to turn around and call us the foolish ones. It's insane. But guys, the whole point of this is that it's foolish to think that anything that we're going to do isn't going to require some sort of sacrifice, right? If I want to like slim down and get those six-pack abs, it's going to require some sacrifice. It's going to require saying no to the cookies and brownies and the ice cream, and it's going to require me putting in hours at the gym. There's going to be some sacrifice involved with that. If I want to try and save up money to buy a house or something, I'm going to have to sacrifice eating out. I'm going to have to sacrifice going and buying, you know, video games and movies, and you sacrifice the entertainment and those sorts of things so that you can put money aside to do something useful and worthwhile. If you want to invest in a relationship with someone, right? There are times when, for instance, my son will come to me and he'll say, Dad, let's go play a video game. And I do not feel like playing that video game. But I'm willing to sacrifice that because I know the window I have with him is small. The same with my wife. When it's 11 o'clock at night and I'm already in my pajamas and she asks me to take the garbage out, I'll sacrifice that, right? I'll go put the pants back on so that I can take the garbage out. Why? Because I want her to be happy and be taken care of. Everything that we have requires an investment. And it's all a trade-off, right? It just is. And we'll trade so many things. We'll trade our time for money. We'll trade, I'll do this for you, and then we'll do this. When I was a kid, we would do movie night, and we would alternate. One week it was my turn to pick the movie, and then the next week it was Erin's turn to pick the movie. And I usually fell asleep during her movies, but I didn't complain about it because I knew I got to pick the next week. It was a sacrifice, but it contributed to the harmony of the family. So anything we're going to do, and the thing is, the more important something is, the more it's going to require. Right? And so it's crazy for us to think that this Christian experience, this Christian walk, this Christian life isn't going to require some sort of effort and some input. And furthermore, it's going to require some failure. I've been listening to a guy named Craig Rochelle. He's pastor of a church, and he was talking about how in his church, one of the things that they do for all of their volunteers, their staff, everybody that works and is part of that church, he says they all have the freedom to fail. Try it. Try something. If it doesn't work, we'll go back to the drawing board and we'll do something else. But if I tell people, you better not mess up or you're fired, you better not mess up or I'm going to take you off the team, when you do that, they're afraid to try anything new, and therefore you stay stuck, right? But if you're willing to say, let's try something different, then sometimes you hit on some hidden gold, right? Sometimes you find the next best way to do something. And so you have to have that freedom to fail. And furthermore, if you're planning on making progress in your life, you better count on failing, right? I mean, there are days, you guys know that Elizabeth and I have been trying to be more healthy, eat more healthy, and there are days when we succeed and there are days when we fail, But just because there are days when we fail and we don't say no to the ice cream, that doesn't mean that the process and that the effort and that the goal isn't worthwhile. It's something that's going to require sacrifice. And we have to be willing to risk that failure if we're going to ever move ahead and move beyond. One of the things that the world tries to do, we try to find the cure for everything. We try to find the fix for everything, right? We try to find what's the cure for depression. What's the cure for loneliness? What's the cure for pain in your body? We always want a fix for something that'll make it go away forever. Well, that's not how it works, right? I mean, even people who aren't prone to depression are going to feel sad sometimes. That's just the way it is, right? That's even people who aren't prone to fits of rage are going to get angry, right? What we have to do is we have to learn how to exist alongside that emotion and say, you know what? I feel this anger. I feel this loneliness. I feel this sadness, but that anger, that loneliness, that sadness, it's not in control. It's not in the driver's seat. It's not the most important thing about this situation. I have to exist alongside of it, acknowledge it, that it's real, it's there, but then I got to move beyond it. Because if I don't, I'm stuck in the same old place. And so we have to expect it. We have to plan for it. We learn to live with it, but then we move beyond it. Because otherwise, you're never going anywhere. So, I offered up some questions here, and for those of you guys who aren't in 2240, I typically like to teach for a little while, and then we kind of open it up, because usually, hopefully, something I've said has sparked some ideas, and we have some things that we would like to share, or maybe you got off on a different point. One thing we said led to another thought process, and so we open it up for some discussion questions. So if you have something to add, just please raise your hand and contribute to the discussion. So number one is, when you made the decision to become a follower of Christ, were you aware of the suffering that would be involved? Did you understand that it was a daily call to die? Um, and yeah, Brandon, you. So for you, salvation was fire insurance, right? Keep me out of hell. Okay. Well, and, and I think I would say you're probably right. I mean, think of how many people made a commitment, but then 6 months from then or a year from then, it seems like they've lost that will to keep trying, right? They're no longer as scared of hell as they were that one night, that one night when the preacher turned the AC off. So, yeah, a lot of us will make a rash decision, and then we come back to it and we realize, hey, this is a lot harder than I thought it was going to be. So you were kind of in, kind of out because you were like, this is harder than I think it's going to be, right? Right.
The experience itself was a distant memory, and you just did things in a pharisaical manner. And every once in a while, something would rock your world, or somebody would come against you, and it would wake you up to the realization this is more than just a lifestyle. This is more than just a 9 to 5. This is what happens between birth and seeing Jesus and living with Jesus forever. And the realization is like sanctification. It's an ongoing process every day.
Yeah, and we have to remind ourselves too of things that we've seen and experienced. Because we can get to a place where we felt an emotional feeling, right? We experienced God. We felt His power and presence, and then for whatever reason, you get living life, you get distracted, and you get away from it. I was reading not too long ago about Peter and how he was one of the three that was there at Jesus' transfiguration. That was a big moment, right? Peter, he was like, I don't even know what to do with this. He said, I don't know what's going on, but I know it's good that we're here. Let's build some tents, right? I mean, he was just that out of himself. He didn't know what he was doing. And yet we see in Second Peter, when he's at the end of his life, he's still looking back at that saying, guys, I was there. I saw when Jesus spoke with Elijah and Moses. And I was there. I heard the voice come from the heavens saying that this is the Son of God. So when I say that Jesus is the Son of God, you can believe me because I heard it. I saw it. And so, like, that was something that he was able to hold on to through decades of his life, through decades of hard life, right? When he was seeing the other disciples being killed and martyred and all that kind of stuff. And at any point, he could have thrown up his hands and said, I'm out of here. But no, he held on to that experience. And that's what helped get him through. But I think it's kind of the same way. Yeah, Miss Kate, you have something to add?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that, I mean, on my part, I knew it was going to be a hard, difficult, journey. But then one thing I knew that I said, Lord, if anything happens, I'm going to trust you. I also gave like my life to Christ as a teenager. I didn't know anything, but there are things I knew I had to give up for the sake of Christ, but I knew it wasn't going to be easy. And so I just flung myself unto him. But if I fail, it will be you, Lord, to be blamed or to be ashamed, because I can't do it myself. And so I went in that way, knowing, of course, that it's going to be a very hard journey, but I'm not alone with
I
walking
think
it.
I think like a lot of things, we don't always realize how hard anything's going to be, right? I mean, it's like for those of us who are married, you get married and you're like, hey, this is a lot harder than I thought it was going to be. Sometimes, some days it's easy, right? It's like, hey, we're on the same page, everything's clicking, it's good. But then there's other start a business, right? Why do you think so many businesses they start and then within the first couple of years they fail? Because the guy says, I didn't realize how hard this was going to be, and I didn't realize the sacrifices I was going to have to make. There's a lot of things in life that we get into and then we realize it's hard. But we can't do that with our faith, right? We can't get into it and say, hey, listen, Jesus, I want you to be Lord of my life. But then when he starts pointing out those things in his life, in your life that he doesn't like, we have to be willing to say, this is going to be hard for me to get rid of, but I'm going to. Right? Yeah.
No,
You
I'm
have
sorry,
something?
I was giving
Oh,
praise.
just agreeing.
Giving
Okay.
praise.
Okay, good.
And also remembering that Jesus actually forewarned us that in this world we are going to have trouble. We are
Right.
going to have, it's going to be hard. But be of good cheer because I've overcome the world.
Right.
So that gives us all the confidence to know that whatever it is, we are going to go through it because he overcame the world.
Right.
We still mirror everything that the disciples went through because we are so obtuse. And they were too. And a lot of times when Jesus was going, how long must I suffer with you? He wasn't talking to the people out there. He was talking to his inner circle right there. Why don't you understand? And I feel like, I look at the guy in the mirror and I recognize him all too well. And I'm like, how long are you going to get it, man? Get it,
Yeah, I'm one of the things that's always blown me away about reading the Bible is like when you read about Israel, right? You got the 12 tribes wandering around in the desert. All right, God has given you, he's parted an ocean for you to walk through. He's given you water out of a rock. He's rained rain from heaven and birds from the sky for you to eat. You've seen all these things. People have attacked you and then they just turn and run away for no reason, right? They've seen all of this stuff and then how are they going to say, hey, let's make a golden calf and worship that, you know? I didn't get it, you know. And then you go to the New Testament, and it's the same thing. The disciples, they saw all those things that Jesus did, and they still didn't get it. And I want to judge them for that, but then I look at my own life, and I think, you know, I've been raised in the church. I know all this stuff. Why am I doing this stuff that I know is not getting me where I need to be? It's crazy sometimes when we think about it, and I think it's because we constantly have to balance that fact. I was reading or listening or something. I did some sort of devotion. It was talking about the man in the mirror, and it was talking about how we can look in the mirror and sometimes we see what's noble and pure and godlike in us, right? We see that image of God that we were created in, that thing that when God looked at us, he said, "Man, this is good," right? Sometimes we look in the mirror, we see that, and then we can turn around. We can come back a couple hours later, and we see something broken and hideous and awful, right? We have both of those things in us all the time. All the time. And so we're left with the daily decision, like T.D. Jakes says, of, whichever dog you feed, that's the one that he's going to win the fight. And so we have to make that decision constantly. So, moving on to the next question, I thought maybe we could open up some opportunities to share some testimony. What are some ways that your faith, your decision to follow Christ have made your life more difficult? Does anybody have an example of something that they would like to share there?
gave out her number and said, if anybody needs anything, you can contact me here. Here's my phone number. Here's my address. If you need anything. And about, I think it was like 3 months later, she got a letter from one of the women that was in there, and she said that God used her because she was gonna, when she got out of jail, she was gonna commit suicide. She already had it planned out and everything. And she said, you were in there and you introduced me to God, and I gave my life to God that weekend while I was, but she never told her. So the things that you do, so God used the situation that, God didn't want her to strike my cousin, but she was where she needed to be. And actually, a couple years ago, I was talking to God, and I was like, I haven't felt you. I said, I want to feel you, like, show me your presence. And then that situation came to my head, and I was just like, oh my, I'm like, I might be in Kentucky away from all my family, but I'm supposed to be here. I'm not with my family or anything, but I know I'm supposed to be here, and God was just like all over that. So that's a cool story. My great grandma went to jail. Like, what? When she found out when I was a teenager and I was going to church, she grabbed me by my collar and pulled me down. You shouldn't be doing that. And just an innocent old lady went to jail for the weekend, and God used her in that situation.
That's like a great little book.
Yeah.
That's a pretty cool story. Yeah, Miss Kate?
Yeah, I have two things to share. One is that when I got saved, I was the first person in my family to get saved. And of course, they didn't isolate me, but they always mocked me, giving me a few days and a few years to give up. But I did not, because Christ who got me could not let me go, as he promised he would never let me go. And one by one, they've all come to know Jesus Christ. Even my father, who died when I was here, before he died, he also gave his life to Jesus Christ. I mean, that was such a blessing that I never told them. I said, he who saved me is going to save you too. And so I prayed for them, and God did that. But I'm listening through the Bible. I'm part of that group with Dr. Majid. Pastor has always told you about him. Maybe some of you listened to him a long time ago. I hear testimonies every day on a daily basis from Muslim who are giving their lives to Christ, and some of them were killed. Others are just, so many things happened to them. One of them was actually acid was thrown at him by his family. And I mean, we don't know what being a Christian is. When you hear these testimonies, it strengthens you so much, because there is a big cost for being a Christian, and some are hiding that they want to let people know, or their families know, but they are following Jesus Christ secretly because of what is going to happen. But I've had those who have come out, and so many things have happened to them, and others it has happened, but they are not dead, but they are just being persecuted, or some of them are cast out of their families. So it's a cost, as it says, you deny yourself or whatever for my sake. If you follow me, that's what it means. But I'm thankful that I hear all these testimonies, and they're just a strength to me, to encourage me that, I need to take my salvation seriously, because some people are dying for it, just as the disciples. All of them were killed. None of them died by themselves. They were killed because of Christ.
And that's a good point. We talk about, how much the world, or at least here in America, how much the American society has turned against Christianity and faith. And what we experience, although it's unpleasant, it's not really risen to the level of persecution yet. We're feeling pressure, right? We're feeling mockery, those sorts of things. But we're not at a place in our country where they'll come and take your kids away from you because you believe in Christianity.
Indianapolis where I went. And I've been working on it for several weeks, but it was ruined just in a twinkle of an eye. And that meant I felt like, Jesus, you could be on the side so I can take over the situation. But I prayed and said, Lord Jesus, take over. Because if we don't, this is going to be very bad. I've suffered, I've gone sleepless nights. This is ruined like this, just because somebody did not pay attention, she just did whatever she wanted to do. And so in that situation, I felt that kind of, I don't know, I wanted to fight. But the Lord, the Holy Spirit took over. And eventually, at the end of it, even when the thing was ruined, I had to give a hug to that person. I said, I forgive you because Jesus forgave me. And so that's the testimony I wanted to give, but it was such a difficult, heartbreaking situation because I have to redo it all again in the end.
Anybody else have something to share? Yeah.
My grandmother, my not the one that went to jail, but my other great grandma, she had passed away a couple years ago, and my stepdad, he's atheist, and I was like, I told him that morning before the funeral, I was like, I know this is probably not the best time to tell you, but I just feel like I need to. And I had been watching people talk about near-death experiences and how they all, like, they're all the same. Like, they all saw God and, was there. And I told him that, and he was like, well, you can't trust, these people and all this stuff. And I'm like, I just felt like I needed to share that with you. And then we went to the church, and the pastor gave his near-death experience, like 20 minutes later. And I was just like, I just started crying, so I was like, wow, like, I just felt like I needed to share that with him. And then later on, I didn't say nothing about it, but I guess my aunt was in the car, and she's like, well, how weird is that she just said something, and then like 20 minutes later, we talked about it. So God shows himself to people in weird ways, and in times of pain too, so you always have to be willing to say what God, you feel God wants you to say, I guess. Even at times when it hurts. So.
Brandon, you had something to add?
I don't know. God's been with me and my family through, so much. I mean, yeah, of course, I have my obvious things that I've shot happen to me. I've been shot. I've had horrible things happen. Rough times in marriage. Uh,
You know what I was thinking, Brandon? When you got shot, you were looking for someone to pray with you.
yeah,
Right
yeah. I
there.
mean, that's what I'm
Like,
saying.
He's
It's
not
like,
even in the ambulance yet, right?
yeah, no. From the moment I got shot, 2 moments after I got shot, I lost my sanctification between the time I got shot to the bottom of the steps, and then and I picked it back up when I got down there. So
You got shot.
so
Excuse. Use that word.
but
Then lose it.
so I was praying, and I asked for people around me to pray. I need anybody here, but oh yeah, we're all believers, blah blah blah. And I'm like, yeah, well, you pray? Yeah, we'll pray with you. And I'm waiting for somebody to pray with me. and I'm like, well,
Now would be
you,
good.
you know what? Fine. I was like, so I just snatched up 2 policemen's hands, and I prayed for me. I prayed for the moron that shot me. I prayed for. I prayed right then and there. I did. I prayed for forgiveness, for me to be able to handle this situation, for me to be able to forgive him right there. Because I know that if I let this ride, it was going to be something that would be a deep-seated hate that I would never be able to purge if I didn't take care of something right there. Because if you don't take care of that stuff right there, it just rides with you for the rest. I mean, I've already dealt with those kinds of things in my life and held on to things that people had done. And I'm like, I'm already going to be dealing with the fact that I got shot. I don't need to take this on down the road with me. But I look at all kinds of things. I've dealt with so, I was like, wow, you know, if I didn't have God there, I mean, you know, I'd have been like, I'm like, you know what, I'm done. Well, we can walk away. You know?
Well, you know, it's so crazy. As long as we feel like we can hold it together by ourselves, we try to do it, you know. And it's really only when we get to that place where it's like, God, I've done everything I know how to do. You know, there's nothing else I can do. That's when we finally turn to God. When instead that should be our first reaction,
Yeah,
right?
I don't, you know, I'm nowhere near the perfect Christian, but I have definitely taken these steps in my life where I don't even, there's probably some things I micromanage in my life that I don't give it to God. But I mean, I tell you what, for the big things, I don't even try anymore. I'm like, nah, it ain't worth it. My life is way too stressful as it is. Why? I try to give it all to God. And I'm like, this is on you, man. I ain't. It's on you.
Tag.
Yep. I mean, I've had several breakthroughs in my life where it got to that place where it's like, God, I've tried this, I've tried that. You know, I've done this that you said in the Bible, and I've done that, and nothing I've done has worked. So it's like, if you're going to be good on your promise, then you're just going to have to be good because there's nothing else I can do. And
Right.
that's when it seems like I have that breakthrough. Well, we're getting close to 8 o'clock, and so I just want to close by, you know, praying a little bit. You know, we've been talking about the hard times. We've been talking about the pain, the suffering, humiliation, and loss. And if you're going through any kind of situation like that in your life right now, would you mind just slipping your hand up, and so that we can pray together? My hand is going up not as an example, but I've got things in my life that I can use prayer for. Okay. Well, then let's all just pray for each other in this room. Father God, we just come to you tonight, and we thank you for this opportunity to come together and to study this example from Jesus, Lord, of how he was trying to train the disciples to be prepared for the hard things that were going to come their way in their lives. Lord, we pray that you would just help us, Lord, to stay committed to you when things come our way. And Lord, as the hands raised tonight show that even those of us who've been following you for years now, there are things in our lives, Lord, where it hurts. It's hard. It's a struggle. And Lord, we know that we can't do anything on our own, but we rely fully on your Holy Spirit. So Lord God, we stand united in agreement, Lord, to lift each other up as brothers and sisters in Christ, Lord, to appeal to you. Lord, you said if we would turn our lives over to you, that you would then watch over us and take care of us and guide our steps and guard our hearts. And so, Lord, we do that now. Lord, for those of us who are in the middle of a painful process, Lord, I pray that your Holy Spirit would give comfort, Lord, and peace in those situations. For those who are experiencing difficulties at work or financial or physical, Lord, whatever those things are, Lord, I pray that you would provide healing or a miraculous touch in those situations. Lord, for those of us who are experiencing loss, Lord, who are grieving a lost relationship or a lost dream or a hope that we had, Lord God, I pray that you would just be with us during this time. And Lord, in this tough time, rather than withdrawing into ourselves, rather than trying to figure it out on our own, help us just to lean on you and to lean on each other. And we pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen. All right. Well, thank you guys for coming tonight. I hope that tonight was useful for you, gave you some things to chew on and think on this week. And we will see you all on Sunday.
Today's Shannon's birthday. I just thought I'd